Yeah, thank you so much. Thank you everyone for joining us for our session today on busting hunger myths. My name is Luke Elzinga. I am the Policy and Advocacy Manager at the Des Moines Area Religious Council, or DMARC. Real quick, before we get started, I just wanted to note we were supposed to have 3 presenters today. Unfortunately, one of our presenters, Tara Kramer, has a complex disability and is dealing with some medical complications with that. She's a board member of DMARC, personally experiences food insecurity, and is just a rock star. So everyone, please send good vibes her way. So now I am going to hand it over to my colleague Blake to get us started.
Hi, everyone. Blake Willitson. It's very nice to be here today to get to talk a little bit more about busting hunger myths, what we're seeing here in central Iowa, and learn a little bit how our work rhymes with what you all are doing, and just talk a little bit more about how you can take things that you're learning here today and run with it. So one of our main focuses here today, we want to talk a little bit more about just first who we are. DMARC stands for the Des Moines Area Religious Council. So we're an interfaith organization started about 70 years ago with a mission of meeting basic human needs here in the greater Des Moines area. So again, if you're not familiar with Iowa, the landscape of the state, Des Moines being the largest metro area right in the center of the state, and where our state capital is located. So here at DMARC, in the mid 70s, we started a food pantry network program that operates a little bit unique to maybe a traditional food pantry or a traditional food bank model. Whereas we act as a supplier where we're providing food at no cost to a network of 14 different brick and mortar food pantry sites. We also offer some other non-traditional options, like we bring a mobile food pantry out to some congregate living settings in areas like major bus stations. And then we also have a no contact home delivery program that started in COVID. But just broadly, we operate that network and assist about 50,000 or more individuals every year. What we talk a little bit more about that experience for folks today. I want to just give you a sense of why we're collecting this data and learn a little bit more about what DMARC is doing with that. So we'll go to the next slide here. One of the most common myths that people who are more in tune with the work that we're doing here, so whether it's other nonprofits or people who have just kind of been doing this work for a long time, tend to ask, why are there so many questions that are being asked of folks when they come through a food pantry, or is this information even necessary to be pulling from folks? So the reason why we're asking this data is clearly so we can paint that broader picture around food insecurity. Every time somebody comes through one of our doors, we're trying to ask just 12 to 14 questions that are being displayed and offered in the least intrusive and most responsible way. A lot of times we like to compare it to something like going to Sam's Club or Costco for the first time and getting that membership, whereas you're providing all that demographic data and some like nuts and bolts that help us the next time you come in, so that it's more of just a check-in. Hey, is this person still in your household? You're good to go. Here's how much food you're getting. So it really doesn't change much in how you answer those questions. Again, we guarantee anyone who comes to the door, we're providing food, even if they don't feel comfortable disclosing that personal information. And other than household size, the answer to those questions don't impact how much food you're receiving itself. But really, those questions tend to be focused on things like education, income, employment status, health and allergies, broad demographic information, and things like, are you a veteran or not? And one thing, just a quick note too, so the way that our pantries are set up, we have our monthly food, which anyone who is accessing that 3-day supply of food is going through and answering those questions. And then if you don't feel comfortable doing so, there's a separate section of our food pantries called anytime items, where somebody maybe who's undocumented or unhoused just doesn't feel comfortable answering those questions or providing additional documentation, would just go through there and receive those items. And so that's a good chunk of the work we're doing. And as we're talking about the data that we capture, that's not including those folks. So there's even more work to be done on telling that broader story. But we'll go ahead to the next slide here and just talk about some of the very basic ways that we're using this data that we're collecting. When we're looking at just the day-to-day, when we're talking with donors, when we're talking with other nonprofit leaders, when we're talking with community members, it is really good that we can have this data not being something that we're gatekeeping, but that's publicly available. So on our website, anybody at any time can go in and see a heat map, go see broad information about how many people are using the Food Pantry Network at a glance at a public dashboard that we produced with the help of I guess, of unicorn volunteer that, somebody who was a former board member and helped us produce this kind of unique tool. The other two main ways that I think we use this data most often are in the settings of things like breaking news. So talking about what we're seeing here and how it relates to the things that are most potent when we're talking about the broader conversation around food insecurity in our neck of the woods. And then just some of the more long-term demographic trends that we're seeing over the course of years, and some of those things that help us dispel those myths that are out there in the community. So we'll go ahead to the next slide here. So that data dashboard, again, we'll put a link in the chat here. It's something that you can explore in your own time, and it provides us a really cool cross-section. So on our back end and on the public end, some of that information, we can go a lot deeper with what we have and literally draw a bubble around a certain area. So if we're talking to a legislator, say, hey, this is what's happening in your district, and this is what happened over the past year as a period compared to what we're seeing in the community generally. We'll go ahead to the next slide here. And then I think one of the most potent communication tools that we have is being able to use that data in real time. So one of the most interesting things that I found, jumping into this, I'm joining DMARC in January this year, was the very third day that I was on this job. We broke a record for the most unique individuals being assisted in one single day. And we've done that about 10 or 11 times now since. So obviously this last few months, it's been significantly impacted by the inflation that we're seeing in all of our communities right now, and the cost of living just being so difficult for folks. So that's pushed a lot of people using our food pantry coming to us for the first time ever, about 1 in 3. When we look at some of this data and broader news events, so just one good example of that might be the possible government shutdown that may be looming ahead. We can point to certain things that have happened in the past, other shutdowns, like in 2015, 2016, we saw a huge jump in traffic after people were running out of the SNAP benefits that were released early here in the state of Iowa. Just looking at that effect of downstream, what's happening at the food pantries when there are changes to major programs for things like SNAP, WIC, et cetera. So we'll go to the next slide here. And then that last piece that I was talking about, I think maybe is the most important when we're talking about myth busting, and having all that information where we can compare across what we're seeing in time, what we're seeing over a long period of time. And one of our most important tools in that has been a report we've put out called Portrait of a Food Pantry Visitor. It's really been a really interesting tool for us over the last 3 years, kind of coming out of what we saw around the murder of George Floyd. We were trying to find a better way to use the data that we're capturing around telling a better story about disparities, how people are being affected by some of these policies that have been in effect for decades, and then just talking broadly about, some of those myths that we're seeing, and how it's been interesting to see that over the 3 years we've been doing this report, when we look at the disparities and some of those demographic differences, those haven't changed a whole lot from year to year, even as the volume of people that are coming through a food pantry have. We'll go ahead to the next slide there. So the name of the report comes from one of the biggest insights that we can kind of share. And we're just talking about, there is no true typical food pantry visitor, but we can spotlight certain areas where we see more common trends in certain things. So for example, one of the most interesting details for a lot of folks is the fact that somebody visiting one of our food pantries really only typically comes about 1 to 2 times over the course of a year. It's about half of the people that utilize one of our food pantries in our network. And that's just one of those small examples. You can also draw some really interesting comparisons when we look at things like redlining and other historical policies that have had a significant impact on those disparities for folks. So this is kind of just that broad picture as I was talking about who is that quote unquote typical food pantry visitor. A lot of people tend to have in their mind maybe somebody who's unhoused when we're thinking about some of those myths that are preset in the community. And maybe somebody is thinking of somebody who is often depending on a system. This is one of those tools where we can point to something that's a little bit more tangible and say, okay, here's just to give you a sense of maybe something a little bit more realistic, who that might be. So go to the next slide here. So obviously, I'm sure this is something that all of you are hearing as well, but one of the more common misconceptions we got right now and something that we continue to talk about is the fact that the work we're doing has changed significantly as pandemic support programs and some of those things that have been available for folks that have helped them navigate this incredibly challenging time have dissipated. So as you look at how people are using our food pantry, since about January of 2022, there was a huge jump right around March, April of 2022 when the end of max benefits in the state of Iowa here for SNAP happened. And so you can see that trend line as I was talking about new individuals being about 1 in 3 people coming to one of our food pantries right now. That's really been the huge motivator as we're seeing this volume sharply increase. And talking about just demographics of those folks that are coming through, while the actual percentages that we've seen from year to year of just overall, this is the overall breakdown of demographics since 2021, that hasn't changed a whole lot. I mean, some of these, it's like a 1/10 of a percentage change year to year. But one of the most interesting things is there was a significant jump in the amount of folks when we look at this past fiscal year who are being affected in the new individuals category of folks that it tends to be a lot more demographically diverse. And we'll go to the next slide here. So I was talking about some of those misconceptions folks often have about who's coming to a pantry. It tends to be really challenging when we're talking about this to paint a broader picture without the data. But a lot of that is just coupling it with what we're seeing in some storytelling elements. And I'll go to the next slide here just because this is really the most impactful piece here. When you look at how people are utilizing our pantries around the concept of who's employed, who's not, it gets missed that about 1 in 3 of those folks who are being assisted by one of our food pantries are 0 to 17 years old children. Another big chunk of that tends to be folks who are senior citizens who are dependent on a fixed income and aren't able to work anymore. So not only is that senior citizens, obviously that's a much larger swath of folks, but when we try and look at just, in particular that subset of children, about 68.5% of those who identified as multi-race, so non-Hispanic, were children. And, that shows us as we're moving forward, the policies that we're targeting, the way that we offer our services, that we need to keep in mind that having a more diverse population is going to impact the way we do things. So I'll go to the next slide here. This is something that I'm sure you're all seeing as well, but here being in the largest metro area in the state of Iowa, there's a lot of misconceptions from folks who are maybe coming from the suburbs or who just don't see that in their day-to-day, how people are being affected by food insecurity. Iowa has about 3.19 million people overall. The Des Moines Metro, that's close to 700,000. And then in the city of Des Moines, so where we're at here today, that's about 200,000 people. But in that cross section, we're seeing about 1 in 5 people here in the city of Des Moines utilizing one of our food pantries. But when you compare those numbers with what we're seeing to the general population, it's significantly more demographically diverse. And a lot of that is rooted in those historic policies and challenges that people have been living with for decades. But when you compare some of the specifics to, one of the smaller communities here in the metro called Clive, that's like a significantly smaller community, but the amount of disparities, for example, in one of the suburbs is extremely, there's a huge difference there when you look at the general population to folks who are using our food pantries. So I've alluded to it a little bit here, but this data is really interesting when you can have partnerships with other agencies, talk about data sharing, and use those numbers in an impactful way to tell a broader story about the way that certain policies have impacted folks over time. And particularly, one of those ways we looked at was in the practice of redlining about 100 years ago, where folks were living, taking a red line map and lining those districts up with our food pantry usage. And what we found is that, a very large chunk of the folks that are using our pantries today still tend to live in those districts that were historically disenfranchised. And that's really important. I mean, even when you're thinking about something as small as one household living in a district could have impacted its classification, and the impact downstream here, just decades down the road, even when you were to add in this graph here and with the suburban communities around, it's still about 50% of most of these demographic groups are living in those C and D districts that were historically disenfranchised. So there's just a quick look at that, and you can see, different groups were affected differently. So I'm going to go ahead and hand it back over to my colleague, Luke Elzinga here. Luke's really focused a lot on the policy and advocacy side of things. And one of the most interesting things, as I was kind of alluding to, with the way that we can compare what's happening downstream at food pantries and what we're seeing with changes to programs like SNAP, is that in this last legislative session, a lot of the myths that we continue to be focused on year over year over year came up, and Luke and our advocates were trying to find better ways to spotlight what's actually happening. So Luke, if you want to talk a little bit more about what you're seeing.
Yeah, thank you, Blake. And so I do our policy and advocacy work, and a lot of that deals with SNAP. And some of these myths and quotes were pretty much taken verbatim from legislators and different groups. So we've been fighting and playing defense on SNAP for about 7 years. And this year we saw the introduction of House File 3 and Senate File 494, which had a lot of different restrictive proposals. And so I'm going to kind of walk through some of those myths we heard around SNAP and ways that we worked to debunk some of those myths. So one that we heard was that spending on SNAP is putting pressure on other parts of our state budget. And the first thing we responded to that with was just looking at the data. So our state puts out a monthly SNAP participation report. We take that data. I should mention too, I'm on the board of the Iowa Hunger Coalition, which is a statewide advocacy group. And with the Hunger Coalition, we've developed this tool called the SNAP Map. And so it takes that data from the state report and puts it in a Tableau public dashboard and just makes it a lot easier to kind of look at the data. But one thing we were able to do because we had that data was talk to our legislators about the fact that SNAP enrollment in Iowa is actually currently at a 15-year low. It's the lowest it's been since July 2008. And then, of course, we also mentioned that SNAP benefits are 100% federally funded, which the usual response we got was, well, yes, but the state shares on administrative costs. So we went and found the data on administrative costs. This is something you can do too. This data is included in the SNAP state activity reports that USDA FNS puts out. So we simply looked back, the past 12 years and could show that admin costs for SNAP have really remained relatively flat and have even somewhat decreased. And actually, the proposals they put forth would only increase that administrative cost to the state. So this was the fiscal note for Senate File 494. I don't expect you to look through all these numbers, but I have some of those stats, the SNAP numbers highlighted of the state share of savings from the law. And obviously, because SNAP benefits are fully federally funded, that was not going to have any impact on the state's budget. But you can also see, if you're looking at the top, that all the administrative work, and I should mention, Senate File 494 did not just target SNAP. It was all public assistance programs, which it kind of defined as Medicaid, Children's Health Insurance Program, and a few other programs. But if you look, the Senate File 494, the fiscal note said this was going to add 218 full-time employees to HHS. And really, most of the savings, almost all of the savings to the state comes from removing people from the Medicaid program. You can also see there, it could potentially lead to a decrease of 5.4 million in SNAP benefits going to Iowans. But again, those are fully federally funded. So this idea that SNAP was putting pressure on the state budget just simply was not in line with the data. Another proposal, in actually a precursor to Senate File 494, House File 3, you may have seen some news on, was restricting people on SNAP to only be able to purchase foods from the WIC approved food list. And then we later saw that kind of rolled back to only look at banning soda and candy from SNAP. But we were running into these myths about people on SNAP spending their money on junk food, or conversely, luxury food items like steak and lobster. So one thing we pointed to was a USDA report. This was from 2016, but it looked at some purchasing from 2011. And that report found that the food spending patterns of households on SNAP and not on SNAP were really not that different. There were some differences, but they weren't anything major. So about 40 cents of every dollar was spent on items like meat, fruit, vegetables, milks, eggs, and bread, both SNAP households and non-SNAP households. Another 20 cents spent on sweetened drinks, desserts, salty snacks, candy, and sugar. And the remaining 40 cents spent on a variety of other items. We also pointed to, this was a report from 2021 that USDA FNS did a large survey of SNAP households, and specifically asking about SNAP participants' barriers to eating healthier. And what that study found was that a large majority, 88% of SNAP participants reported facing challenges to a healthy diet. And the number one reason that was given by participants was the high cost of healthy foods as a barrier. 61% of people surveyed gave that as a response of barriers to eating healthy. It also found that SNAP participants who struggled to afford healthy foods were much more likely to experience food insecurity. So aside from the data, I think we also tried to push back on this idea that the government should be telling people what to eat or policing what people should eat. And I just wanted to read, this is a section from the book Evicted by Matthew Desmond. Great book. I encourage you all to check it out from your local library. And this is from a chapter called Lobster on Food Stamps. And I'm just going to read this out loud. You can read along with me. But this is a story that Matthew Desmond, one of the individuals he was kind of interviewing and following along, he relays Lorraine's story. Lorraine didn't put anything on layaway that day, but when her food stamps kicked in, she went to the grocery store and bought 2 lobster tails, shrimp, king crab legs, salad, and lemon meringue pie. Bringing it all back to Beaker's trailer, she added Cajun seasoning to the crab legs and cooked the lobster legs in lemon butter at 350 degrees. She ate everything alone in a single sitting, washing it down with Pepsi. The meal consumed her entire monthly allocation of food stamps. It was her and Glenn's anniversary, and she wanted to do something special. I know our relationship may not have been good, but it was our relationship, she said. Some things I will not ever get over, but the lobster helped. People like Lorraine lived with so many compounded limitations that it was difficult to imagine the amount of good behavior or self-control that would allow them to lift themselves out of poverty. The difference between grinding poverty and even stable poverty could be so vast that those at the bottom had little hope of climbing out, even if they pinched every penny. So they chose not to. Instead, they tried to survive in color, to season the suffering with pleasure. They would get a little high or have a drink or do a bit of gambling or acquire a television. They might buy lobster on food stamps. If Lorraine spent her money unwisely, it was not because her benefits left her with so much, but because they left her with so little. She paid the price for her lobster dinner. She had to eat pantry food the rest of the month. Some days, she simply went hungry. It was worth it. I'm satisfied with what I had, she said, and I'm willing to eat noodles for the rest of the month because of it. And the reason I share this story is I think it's very easy for people who have never personally experienced poverty to try and lecture people about what they should be spending their money on, or if you just budgeted right, you'd be able to figure this out. And I think it leaves out that basic humanity of people being able to make choices, and maybe making choices that you don't necessarily agree with, because it helps them feel a little more human in that moment. And so I think a really important part of busting this myth is that data, but another important piece is sharing those personal stories. And Tara was going to share part of her testimony during House File 3 that would have banned soda and candy, and talking about her complex health conditions and dietary needs, and the fact that her doctor has told her to keep a Snickers bar in her purse in case of a blood sugar drop. And I think those stories are really important for our legislators to hear, because it's not a world they're necessarily living in day to day. Another comment we heard a lot during the legislative session was that SNAP has a high rate of fraud and abuse. We specifically heard this number brought up that, there was almost $7 million in SNAP fraud this, the past year. And so we went and looked and tried to figure out where this number was coming from. It came from a Iowa Department of Inspections and Appeals annual report. And you can see here in this annual report, this figure, this taxpayer dollars saved. One thing I will note, there was only 3.5 million that actually went out the door. The other that needed to be reestablished and paid back. The other half of it was cost avoidance. Essentially, now that we've identified these funds that shouldn't have gone out, they won't be going out in the future. So I think that's just important to bring up. But in the report, it mentions that HHS disqualified 195 SNAP recipients through administrative disqualification hearing as a result of investigative work, what we call intentional program violations, or IPVs. So I actually did some calculations to try and figure out what that fraud rate was. But we also had a legislator who was thinking around the same idea. And this is from an email newsletter from Representative Beth Wessel-Krishel, who is the ranking member of the Health and Human Services Committee in the Iowa House. And she reached out to the Legislative Services Agency, LSA, which is kind of our nonpartisan research staff at the Capitol, and got a response back from them that there's no official SNAP fraud rate that comes from an HHS report or a USDA report. But the recent FY22 DIA report shows 195 SNAP disqualifications. And using the average Iowa SNAP enrollment of about 287,000 people in that fiscal year, they calculated a fraud rate of 0.07%. So that was actually the same rate I had calculated, but it's helpful coming from a respected agency like LSA to say, look, we asked the question, here's that number. And what that ended up translating to is media coverage on that, really showing that this welfare fraud idea was a myth, and that it is such a small rate, I think really helped shut down that argument. One theme that we have heard over the years as we've seen these bills is that we need greater program scrutiny, additional administrative hurdles to protect SNAP for the truly needy. This is the group that has really been pushing these bills in Iowa and other states. The Foundation for Government Accountability, they are a Florida-based free market think tank. Their lobbying arm, Opportunity Solutions Project, has been active in Iowa for 7 years. And this is how they talk about it, that welfare reform means preserving resources for the truly needy. I noticed they stopped saying protecting. I'm sure that was deliberate. And that is a phrase we heard over and over and over again. I recently completed my Master of Public Policy and had to take an econ class as part of that. And I came across this concept of ordeal mechanisms. And this is an example from my textbook that just I was flabbergasted when I read it, because I had heard people pushing these arguments, and here it was as a theory in print. And so I'm going to read this. It says, an example of ordeal mechanisms. An example illustrates the power of ordeal mechanisms as a targeting device. The government wants to set up a soup kitchen for low ability individuals who are poor, but the government cannot tell whether individuals are truly low ability or high ability and low performers, or just lazy. The government can either hire a large number of workers for this soup kitchen, so no one has to wait very long for a meal, or they can hire a small number, so there is always a line outside. It seems inefficient to make needy and hungry individuals wait in line for their meal, but doing so might reveal who truly needs the free food. The long line might prevent the more able from using resources that they don't need and are not really intended for them. And when I read that, I took that personally, because here is this theory that we had been pushing back on for years and seeing it written out in text. And I made it my goal for my final paper to really discredit that theory. Because there is a lot of research that shows that ordeal mechanisms, features deliberately made to make a program less attractive, more cumbersome, they actually harm the most vulnerable members of our society that they are, talking about protecting. So there's a lot of research here. I've just shared some of this here, but ordeal mechanisms inflict stigma on both those quote unquote deserving and undeserving of benefits because outsiders have no way to distinguish between the two groups. Welfare stigma induces negative self-recognition and is a risk factor for major depressive disorder for SNAP recipients. This one kind of blew me away when I read this study. This is a 2016 study that found the psychological costs of being enrolled in SNAP, also known as stigma, appear to outweigh any positive nutritional and health benefits gained from the program. So we're deliberately making the program inaccessible, creating stigma around it, and that is eliminating any positive outcomes that we're hoping to see from the program. Another piece of this is also time costs. There's psychological. This is all econ speak, by the way. This is not how I talk about it, but sometimes you've got to speak their language. So there's psychological costs, stigma. There's also time costs. And so examples of that are program complexity, rigorous screening processes, and those impose disproportionately high costs on low ability individuals and those with little free time. Again, those most vulnerable members of our society that you're claiming to be trying to protect benefits for are going to be the most likely to lose benefits because of these administrative hurdles that you're putting forth. If you are interested in this topic, if you can tell, I'm very interested in it. I want to recommend the book Administrative Burden, Policy Making by Other Means by Pamela Hurd and Donald P. Moynihan. I had a fangirl moment during the legislative session because they actually wrote a blog post, a Substack article about the bills in Iowa and really broke down, the effect that it's going to have on people and trying to debunk some of those myths. And I'll also do a personal plug for that final econ paper. If you're interested in reading the whole thing, I'm happy to send that along. It's only like 5 pages, so it's not a super long read. But with that, I want to thank you all. And I'm going to see if we have any questions from anyone. So feel free to put them in the chat or the Q&A. Sorry, I'm just scrolling up through the chat. Aaron, I loved your comment. Sometimes you just want candy to help you get out of a bad day. Exactly. That's something that everyone deserves. And Gabriella, I can maybe just upload that paper on Excel events for everyone to just be able to access it through there.
But if there's anything else that you're seeing that we discussed throughout the whole presentation, again, the slides are available out there. So if you wanted to reference back to anything in particular there, or just shoot us a message after the fact, please let us know.
Luke, Blake, I really want to thank you both for presenting today. Extremely cogent topic that you all are discussing, so appreciate you doing that. Up next is a main stage session using research to create hunger-free communities. In just a moment, a window will pop up with a prompt for you to join our next session. Just click the join button to enter. That concludes our time together. Have a great rest of your day. Thanks, folks.